if you picked up 10 people on the street and said, hum a famous classical music tune, I reckon more than half of them would hum a tune that was written by Tchaikovsky.
Hi there, welcome to another episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, the podcast where you learn about some of the greatest works of the string quartet canon from the intimate insights of violinists Dale Barltrop, Francesca Hiew, violist Chris Cartlidge and cellist Michael Dahlenburg. I'm your host, Sam Jozeps. I'm really glad you're here. Today you'll hear about what I think is one of the most ubiquitous musical voices going around, and it's probably not who you think it is. But I would put good money on you having heard some of his tunes at least 3 times in the past 12 months. It's Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, and today we're chatting about his String Quartet No.1 in D Major Op.11 nicknamed The Accordion. Here's a quick minute on Tchaikovsky. He was a Russian composer born in 1840. He spent most of his composing life in Moscow and died in 1893, aged 53. He was a composer of the Romantic era, coming after the likes of Haydn and Mozart, Mendelssohn, Chopin and Schumann, and before the likes of Sibelius, Satie, Rachmaninoff, Ravel and Bartók. He was the first Russian musical voice to really make waves in Western Europe and America. He gained most notoriety for his ballet music. Think Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, Sleeping Beauty and Romeo and Juliet. Other massive works of Tchaikovsky's included his 1812 Overture, his first piano concerto, and his violin concerto. You'll hear Michael and Fran mention it in this podcast, but amongst his peers, Tchaikovsky was a little bit different. In some sort of syncopation to Russian music of the day, Tchaikovsky composed to the beat of his own drum and found himself balancing on a precarious fence planted between Russian nationalism and a rapidly globalizing Western world. So what I'd like to know is this. What is it about Tchaikovsky's music that enchanted not just his compatriots, but the West as well? And what makes us still love his music so much today? At the end of this pod, I'll try to answer this inquiry, but you may well draw your own alternate and perhaps even contradictory conclusion. That's the beauty of it all.
My name is Dale Barltrop.
My name is Francesca Hiew.
My name is Chris Cartlidge.
And I'm Michael Dahlenburg from the Australian String Quartet.
I hope you enjoy this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet.
Tchaikovsky, he's one of my go-tos. I remember as a child growing up listening to the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, a cassette tape. It was my favourite piece of music for a long time.
So I love Tchaikovsky. I would go as far as to say maybe top 8, potentially top 5 favourite composers. He has a beautiful way of creating a world that you just want to continue to live in. The sound world of fantasy and melody.
He sat alongside but wasn't part of the big Russian Five group of composers.
So, the Russian Five, they sound like some kind of notorious hip-hop group from the St. Petersburg underground, and I guess they were kind of the 19th century equivalent. The Russian Five consisted of Cesar Cui, Alexander Borodin, Mily Barakirev, Modest Mussorgsky, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Apart from being a bit of a mouthful to say, these composers outwardly wrote for and promoted a purely Russian sound of classical music. Something unaffected by the influences of Central and Western Europe. Something that Tchaikovsky wasn't really into doing.
He had slightly different artistic endeavours to them. He wanted to have Russian music in his own voice that would be embraced by the rest of the world. He sort of was an individual in this way. He did his own thing.
I love Tchaikovsky. I think he holds a unfortunate place in history. He wasn't quite Russian for Russia, wasn't quite Western for the rest of the world. He's not ridiculed or looked down upon, but people form a view, which is ironic, I think, because if you picked up 10 people on the street and said, hum a famous classical music tune, I reckon more than half of them would hum a tune that was written by Tchaikovsky.
So I didn't actually go out onto the street and ask 10 people to hum a classical tune, but if anybody does get inspired to do that, please let me know your findings. What I have put together, though, is a little mashup of some choice Tchaik tunes that you will no doubt recognise. Here we go. This is from just 2 ballets, Nutcracker and Swan Lake. I could have done so many more. It's just my licensing budget that's holding me back.
I mean, it could almost be up there with Beethoven, Mozart in encapsulating Western classical music. You know, when we think of symphonies, we think of Beethoven, we think of Mozart, we think of Tchaikovsky, we think of ballet, you think of Tchaikovsky.
For Tchaikovsky, that was actually mission accomplished. He loved Western composers. He thought that the style in which they wrote was beautiful. But he had such love for his home country, but he wanted to find his voice, his particular way of writing, which didn't necessarily align with what was fashionable at the time. He was on the outside looking in. He didn't go to the same conservatories. You know, he started at it late in life, but he had this almost like a mission that he wanted to find his voice that could marry those two worlds together. Some people go, oh yeah, but it's all a bit simplistic, you know, it has just sort of folk tunes. But actually it's much, much, much more than just he went round and found folk tunes and put it in his music, which is actually an incredible feat at the time. Musicologists do that all the time, which is actually what Tchaikovsky was doing long before anybody else. But, you know, Bartok is heralded doing that, but actually Tchaikovsky did it first. And through that, he found a unique place for himself that almost no other composer has done since. And almost every piece he ever wrote has this very, almost like a spirituality about it, you know, like it speaks to you as a person, which is why, you know, you listen to Tchaikovsky's music and it really sort of wells you up.
He's, of course, very, very well known for his ballets and his orchestral symphonic works, lesser known for his chamber music works, of which he only composed a few things, just 3 string quartets amongst them, and this one being No.1, which I think is, you know, probably the most well known of the 3.
This quartet, not one of his most iconic works, but he did write some really amazing chamber music. He wrote it when he was around the age of 30, I believe, and it is just brimming with beautiful melodies, lush harmonies, heart on the sleeve rhetoric. It, I think, is by far his most successful string quartet.
So he was fresh out of school. He was quite elderly, he was in his 30s, and he had a job at the conservatory and he didn't have much money and he needed to make his mark on the landscape, but he couldn't afford to hire an orchestra. And so he thought, well, how do I get my stuff out there? And so he went for what he could afford, which was 4 people. because he couldn't just write piano music, which he wrote beautiful piano music and sonatas and duos, but he thought, I need to show some greater depth of compositional complexity, and thus this quartet was born. But sometimes out of, necessity, beautiful things are made.
It really does have the spirit of Tchaikovsky's music, and you can hear his fingerprints all over it. But what I do really love about it is that he does appropriate his sound and his aesthetic to a string quartet. Occasionally it sounds epic and grand and orchestral, but there's also a real intimacy.
It's challenging. It's beautiful writing, but it's difficult to play. It's full of storytelling and dance and beautiful song lyricism and optimism.
I love that it starts out in this very intimate way. The quartet is often nicknamed the accordion, and it's because of this opening that we're all playing together.
It conjures an image of this squeeze box. The quartet does a unified thing, so we all do the same thing for a couple of lines.
We're sort of, breathing this thing together, and then the music sort of slowly flows out from this moment, which I love. It's just the beginning of this huge journey that is yet to come.
But then it breaks off into Tchaikovsky-esque enormous counterpoint and complexity. He found a way to be really earnest, but then also to show his depth, and that in the first page just has me. That's the mark of great composition. Within one page, he covers the whole gamut of his body of work. His entire life of work is symbolized in that one page, which is pretty amazing.
Particularly the first movement I find quite grand and huge, almost kind of like a movement of a symphony. You always get this reaction from the audience, sort of like, oh, like you've been through this huge journey already, and it's just the beginning.
Other than this lush, beautiful first movement that is, quite a tour de force in and of itself, we then move into the Andante Cantabile, which is one of his greatest hits. It is this beautiful tune. It's a very simple Ukrainian folk tune, in fact, that Tchaikovsky first heard on a trip to visit his sister. It has, I think, become such a cult classic of Tchaikovsky's. It's been arranged for different instrument combinations. There's a solo cello version, and it's heard quite a lot. It really is just the most poignant moment of the quartet. And particularly towards the end of that movement, where the other three are all just pitching this heartbeat, this constant heartbeat. Boom, 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 boom. And then I play the most delicate melody over the top of that. It's just extraordinary music. It really is. Tchaikovsky at his best.
There's a moment in, well, actually the whole second movement, he actually has the two violins and viola playing in absolute unison, just one single line. he brings everything down into this really intimate cell, and that movement being based off essentially a folk song, so that one can just hum to. There is something, I guess, very human about it that really appeals to people. What I love about it is that he doesn't really mess with it. He just presents it in this way that is just sort of perfect. The last movement is kind of interesting because it doesn't start out with a big bang like the first movement. It sort of starts with this simple kind of, I don't know, sort of wafty melody. And then it again develops into this final movement kind of allegro, and then we're running from there.
Playing the Tchaikovsky quartet, playing any Tchaikovsky is very physically and mentally taxing. He really goes above and beyond. There are moments of intimacy, but there's also, these huge sweeping lines and quite thick orchestration. It requires, a degree of athleticism. And I think that, we have to be careful to pace ourselves, to not give it all away in the first movement.
I mean, a work of this popularity, but also of this level of craftsmanship, always is difficult. There are so many ways phrases can go, so many discussions along the way that lead us to where we end up, and every performance is different. It's always a journey. Tchaikovsky, it's just so easy to get swept up in what he writes and the worlds that he creates. And for someone who hasn't heard this before, I would just enjoy it. Just sit back and relax, because it's just let it wash over you. It's a beautiful experience.
The reaction so far of our audiences has been tears in the second movement. That has been, the moment that really captures people, and I understand why. That's a very personal moment. I think for the audience, it's a breath of fresh air, despite being this old piece. We've had really wonderful reactions.
The first time when I heard the whole quartet all the way through, when I can't remember how old I was, maybe 12, 13, I was struck, firstly, that there was only 4 people playing. Because Tchaikovsky has this effect that he can create much more than there actually is. And also that it was very emotional. I think it was perhaps preloaded because I just read a lot of stuff about Tchaikovsky and the bitter end of Tchaikovsky, and maybe I was influenced by that. But I think we're always influenced when we're listening to music. Either we've had a good day or a bad day, or we're in a good mood or a bad mood. But that the music makes you feel something, which is, the most important thing about art, right? Is that it makes you feel something. And I think you'd be very hard-pressed to have any audience not feel profoundly something, whether it be good or bad, from this music.
I think this piece really can transport the listener. It can be a celebration of folk music and Russian nationalism, but it's also just plain old great music. And I think that it is the kind of piece that will make people smile.
Sometimes music, is intellectual or, impressive. lots of fireworks. Or it just is, and this just is. And I think it speaks to anybody.
Yeah, it's just something you can't stop yourself jumping on board, getting involved.
So, in the end, how has Tchaikovsky's music thrived for so long? And how is it still so relevant today? After all this, it seems to me that Tchaikovsky's success is due to the manifestation of a delicate, precise, and meaningful musical negotiation between two strong and enduring voices, nationalism and globalism. And how did he do this? Well, he curated them, synthesized them, and then created to make something new. But here's the clincher. I feel like he used his immense talent not just at composing, but more importantly, at listening, to conjure a musical language that spoke, as Michael says, to everybody. Could it be that Tchaikovsky made it so that through listening to his music, anybody could themselves feel listened to? Do we all feel heard by Tchaikovsky? In a way, I hope so. I find this concept to be poetically, ironically, beautiful. It makes me wonder what his music might sound like if he were alive today. While our world is physically and digitally more connected than ever, perhaps interpretations of nationalism and globalism are just as strong. And what about technology? Would Tchaikovsky embrace AI, computer programming, and digital sound manipulation in music making? In whatever its manifestation, Tchaikovsky's openness to new ideas and new influences makes me think that it doesn't even matter how he produces his art, or what kind of art he even chooses to produce. What matters is, and perhaps what matters most about the future of all art and all expression, is that it speaks to us. Humans. Or any being that listens. Thanks for listening to this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. The music featured in this episode includes Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D Major Op.35, performed by Julia Fischer and the Russian National Orchestra, conducted by Yakov Kreuzberg, used with permission by Pentatone. Excerpts from his ballets The Nutcracker and Swan Lake, as well as Tchaikovsky's String Quartet No. 1 in D Major Op.11 Accordion, performed by the Australian String Quartet. You can listen to the full work via asq.com.au or your streaming platform of choice. For every episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet, we commission and feature an original piece of music by a contemporary artist, using samples from that episode's subject. This episode's sampler was created by producer, artist and songwriter Jian Liu. Listen to the whole track and learn more about this incredible producer via asq.com.au/podcast. The theme music for this podcast was created by Ghana-based composer, producer and multi-instrumentalist Adam Page. This episode was recorded on Whadjuk Country, Perth, Western Australia, and produced and edited on Kaurna Country, South Australia at the University of Adelaide. Thanks for listening to this episode of Inner Voices with the Australian String Quartet. If there were a pot of golden string quartets sitting far off in the distance, consider this series your rainbow. See you next time.